Okay, hello everybody. So we're in chapter 4, and you've been doing your matching assignment and true-false assignments on chapter 4, so I'll try to get those graded and turned around to you, let you know if you got any questions wrong. Now, chapter 4, we're covering the whole chapter. Chapter 4, this is the beginnings of modern science and philosophy. And all of this kind of begins, they talk about in the Renaissance. That's right, the Renaissance. Anyway, Italian word means rebirth. So we skipped over a chapter. And so you had the early Greek philosophers. And, then through the Roman time. And then you had what was called in Europe anyway, the Dark Ages, or that's one name for it, or Middle Ages. Where you had the Western Roman Empire that collapsed, right? And so that was Europe, right? Western Europe, we think of it today. So kind of all of the Greek and Roman philosophy and all the classics were largely lost to Western Europe during the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. And then you had this period of the Crusades, started by several popes and other leaders in Western Europe to retake Jerusalem and that sort of stuff. Well, in the East, you had Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, that thrived for a period of time, much longer than the Western Roman Empire, which collapsed, of course. So you also had in the East, Islam that came about, and really those ancient Greek philosophers, like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all those old works had been preserved in the East, in both Byzantium and in the Islamic world. All those ancient writings had been preserved that had largely been lost to Western Europe. So partly as a result of trade and partly as a result of war, these ancient classics were reintroduced to Western Europe and became very popular during the Renaissance period, right? The Renaissance. So the Renaissance, the book gives a rough date from around 1450 to around 1600 as being the time period for the Renaissance, or rebirth in Western Europe, basically. And it does mention that Renaissance humanism had a number of themes that were very important in it. So they talk about 4 major themes that were very important to Renaissance humanism. And so let's mention those, right? Individualism, an emphasis on the individual, right? So there is a lot of interest in humanism and interest in individual human beings and in how important and influential an individual could be, right? So basically human potential and human achievement was, and the individual, the potential importance of an individual was one of the main themes of Renaissance humanism. Now, although we're saying that they were interested in the individual and what the individual could achieve and accomplish, right, really the Renaissance happened to the upper class. All right? I mean, that's who the Renaissance influenced. I mean, the peasants were pretty much left alone, still struggling and all that kind of stuff. Well, it changed a little bit for them. But mostly this stuff is what's influencing the ruling class. So there was an intense interest in the individual. So individualism. And then they talk about a personal religion, the importance of a personal religion to these Renaissance humanists, right? So you do have individuals, once again, looking at the Bible and seeing what early Christianity was like, and they didn't see that in the church. And of course, by the church, at this point, we're talking about the Catholic Church, which was the only Christian church in Western Europe, right? There was no option. This was there, and of course, well, the bishops, the popes, the cardinals, they can be very, live very affluently, right? Have a bunch of possessions, land, and act like princes, and they're vested in all their gold and all this stuff. And that didn't seem to be true Christianity to a lot of these Renaissance humanists. So we'll see that some of these Renaissance humanists, most of them, were thought of themselves as devout Christians. It's just that they wanted to either reform the church, the Catholic Church, or, of course, we're going to mention the big guy here in this chapter, Martin Luther, who decided you got to break away from the church. And then that started the Protestant Reformation, and you have your first option in Western Europe to Catholicism, right? So it's difficult for maybe us to think of this today, but as I said, there was only one church. There were no denominations. There was one church in Western Europe. It was the Catholic Church. So personal religion is also what they want. And then another major characteristic, the third major characteristic they mention, deals with an intense interest in the past, an intense interest in these ancient writings that have been rediscovered, right? And it gets a little complicated here because we did skip part of chapter 3, where some of these works were being reintroduced. But they mention a few things here at the beginning of chapter 4 in regards to intense interest in the past. Well, some of these works had been, the authors had been misidentified, so a lot of Renaissance humanists wanted to, correctly attribute who wrote this stuff. And a problem here in this intense interest in the past, too, I guess it's going to come up in the next point, I'll mention it. But so they wanted to, read of a wide variety of ancient views, attribute those appropriately to the proper individuals. And so you had this influx of new ideas that was exciting during the Renaissance humanism, too. Of course, that could get you in trouble sometimes, right? And then the last fourth characteristic, major characteristic or theme of Renaissance humanism is Anti-Aristotelianism, right? Anti-Aristotelianism, Aristotelianism. All right, so something that had happened prior to this point, prior to the Renaissance, is some of Aristotle's philosophy had been reintroduced to the Western Europe. And basically, the Catholic Church had made parts of Aristotle's philosophy, had incorporated it into church dogma. And church dogma in the Catholic Church, this is truth. All right? So that's called scholasticism, is what that was called, right? Scholasticism, the incorporation of Aristotle's philosophy into church dogma. Once it was incorporated into church dogma, scholasticism, well, you can't question it. It's church dogma now, right? And that was another thing that many of these people had a huge problem with was, well, we know these ancient writers were human. How can you attribute that stuff written by a human being, or at least not inspired, I guess, right, by the Holy Spirit? How can you say that's truth, right? So these guys didn't like that. So they were anti-Aristotelianism, or they were anti-scholastic. They wanted anything, a philosophy, to be pushed out. This is not true. Didn't come from the Bible or religion. So why are you saying this is church dogma and unchallengeable? And of course, that becomes a problem with some of the people in this chapter later on, with Copernicus and some of those early scientists. They're coming up with theories that go against what Aristotle said in his philosophy, and that was church dogma, and so they got into trouble for that. All right. So anyway, those are the four kind of themes of Renaissance humanism: individualism, personal religion, an intense interest in the past, and anti-Aristotelianism.